Dramatic pause. Hi, Michelle.
Hi,
Matt. So we're here on Blogging Heads on a slightly less than 1 hour version of it, and it's Monday morning after the weakest horribilis for the left side of the political spectrum. Do you want to tell me what made you the most sad last week?
Well, I'm not well, actually, should we introduce ourselves
first? Sure.
I'm
Matt Welch from Reason Magazine, which is your magazine for free minds and free markets. And that's that.
And I'm Michelle Goldberg. I'm an author, but I'm also a columnist for the American Prospect and for the Daily Beast. And, I'm not a monster. And so the worst thing about last week was clearly the, apocalypse in Haiti. And I wouldn't want to compare the apocalypse in the Democratic Party to, the real. That was kind of a constant check for me whenever I let myself be too carried away by despair. That to a certain extent we don't know what despair is. That said, I've never, in all my years of following politics, writing about politics, being involved in politics, I have never been so disappointed in the Democratic Party and so kind of hopeless about the prospects of governing this country in a way that I would consider to be intelligent and decent.
Wow.
And I've never been one of those people who, there's a lot of people who kind of, make it a habit to disparage the party, and who constantly, even if they didn't vote for Nader, they maybe would have thought that he would have made a better president than Al Gore. I've always identified myself, or not always, but, for most of my adult life, I've identified myself as, a Democrat and a liberal, rather than, a kind of leftist who has to vote for the Democrats because it's the, the better of two evils. I've always understood the sacrifices, or not just the sacrifices, the compromises that they make to, kind of governing a country that is well to the right of my own personal policy preferences. I've always understood that someone who governed the way I would ideally want them to govern, someone who made the kind of choices that I would want them to make, couldn't lead this country. And so, I've always kind of understood the compromises and the sausage making and the disappointments. But that is so different than what we're seeing now, which is just kind of the most abject capitulation. And it's capitulation. What's so frustrating is that it's not even, from my perspective, it's not even kind of the kind of capitulation or the kind of compromise that you do out of grim realism because you think it's going to ultimately, save an unsalvageable situation. It strikes, it's both weak and immoral, frankly, but also, I think, ultimately politically suicidal. Somebody called it Jonestown on the Potomac, and that's what it seems to me.
What's the, where is the kind of original sin in the, for you, from your point of view, in like the compromising or the weakness, or the capitulation in your terms? When did that happen? Was it last week, or was it 12 months ago?
No, it was last week. It wasn't, there was, to me, as far as I was concerned, there was much to, there was much to object to in both the Senate bill and the House bill. There was, lots of things that I wish wasn't in there. In my perfect world, we would have single-payer health insurance, like a proper civilized Western country. That said, all of the compromises that they made, all of even the really ugly deals with the insurance companies, as well as the incredibly disappointing capitulations on abortion rights, which is an issue that's very close to my heart. All of those struck me as kind of somewhat defensible, defensible recognitions of political reality. The capitulation was that they lost this one race, and it was a big deal, but they lose this one race and they run screaming from the hills as if they've been swept out of power, as if now that we only have a 59-seat Senate majority, the president, and a majority in House, that means what? We can't do anything? What's so disappointing is that they can pass health insurance at this point, and they can do it without Republicans' help. And they're choosing they seem to be choosing not to for a whole host of reasons, some of which I think are total misreading of kind of the nature of political power and public support. I think that people might be frustrated with the entire with the way healthcare has played out. But I can't imagine that anybody thinks that they're going to find political salvation in now kind of scrapping years worth of work that they've already voted in favor of and so already are associated with. I mean, it's just lose-lose in every imaginable way from my point of view.
There's, a lot of stuff to chew on there. It seems to me that their decision to, run for the hills does have at least one kind of, there's a pragmatic source of it, which is just the whole freak out of, oh my God, if we lose Teddy Kennedy's seat, anything is possible in November. And as soon as members of the House of Representatives have that in their brains, and it's not just, Scott Brown, it's also the governor's races in Virginia, New Jersey, and even New York 23, and in some ways even the town hall meetings.
Well, what do you mean New York 23?
No, I mean...
because New York 23 was actually a kind of counterexample.
Well, it is and it's not. I mean, in the sense that New York 23 was just a volatile, spasm. Regardless of outcome, it was an example of voter anger, tumult, freakout. And so, I think political parties like their voters to be predictable. Yeah, but don't you think that there's a very interesting difference in the way that granted, I don't think New York 23 is comparable to losing Teddy Kennedy's seat, which is, just an absolutely massive blow. But there's such a difference in the way the two parties have reacted, right? I mean, we lost Teddy Kennedy's seat, and all of a sudden you see basically Democrats rushing to abandon their core principles, rushing to abandon, frankly, everything that Teddy Kennedy devoted his life to. The Republicans lose New York 23, obviously, because, there's kind of no question that it's because because of this right-wing insurgency and kind of right-wing intransigent. And their reaction is essentially to declare victory and say, bring it on, we're going to do more of the same. Well, it makes sense on some level. Republicans right now, and there was an interesting piece in the New York Times, I think on Saturday or Friday, about the Republicans' weird dance with the Tea Party movement right now. Because the Tea Party movement is of the right, for sure, but it does not want to be a Republicanoid thing just yet. And so you have cases of, I think the case in the Times piece was of a guy running for office in Colorado who went on, and he's been friendly with the Tea Party folks.
Wait, hold on, my phone just fell off.
And he went on Fox News, and they put on the ticker underneath him, this is the...
Hey, Matt, hold on. I had technical difficulties. I just dropped my phone.
Oh, okay.
So you were just talking about the Colorado.
Right. Long story short, the Tea Party movement is a tiger tail situation, and so Republicans are trying to figure out how to co-opt it if they can or tap into it, but ultimately it's a source of anger that's growing. The net anger at this country. I mean, you talked about the you're able to grin and bear it when it comes to the sausage making, but the sausage making and the attendant compromises and just kind of uglinesses that were associated with it, that is part of the reason why healthcare reform became unpopular over the last 12 months. I mean, it's a direct result for the Democrats right now to do what you want them to do, which is say, look, we still do have 59 votes here, which is totally true. I mean, I've never seen such a weak, stunning majority in my life. But for them to pass through a major overhaul of something that's pretty significant, that is totally unpopular at the moment, is a kind of political gamble that the likes of which we really haven't seen in a long time. And in an atmosphere when all of this tumult is happening, and there's been a lot of kind of anti-incumbent fury. I can see from a pragmatic point of view why they'd want to do it. I do agree, though, that there is something kind of fundamentally pathetic. I mean, the Onion headline was great from like 5 months ago. Democrats hope to win government back from Republican minority in 2010, and I think we're seeing some of that right now.
Well, there's two different points here. I mean, one is on the question of principle. Presumably we campaigned and elected Democrats, and Democrats, campaigned and devoted their lives to government. I mean, as naive as that sounds, presumably for a reason, not just so that they can have these, kind of frankly not terribly well-paying jobs in Washington. I don't understand. It's not as if, I think Matthew, what's that?
They are pretty well paid ultimately. But.
Well, most of these people, it's not like they're going to have to go out and get a job at Starbucks if they're voted out of office. They're going to a lot of them are going to get jobs, as consultants or lobbyists or, board members of various corporations making a lot more money than they're making now in government. What's so striking to me is that the risks are the idea that being voted out of office is not the worst thing that can happen to someone. And although I think you have to make certain compromises in order to stay in office if you think you can do more good in the long term, this is the long term. This has been the long-term goal of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement for decades and decades and decades. And although I understand that it's unpopular, I'm not sure that how unpopular, it seems to me that the process has been more unpopular, and it's unpopular because people don't, frankly, know what's in it. The fact that the Massachusetts voters were rejecting it so overwhelmingly, or not overwhelmingly, whatever,
yeah.
He won 51% of the vote. But the fact that Massachusetts voters were rejecting it isn't a sign that Massachusetts voters don't like this kind of healthcare reform. It's a sign that they do, that they have it for themselves and they're happy with it and they don't want to rock the boat.
Well, actually, I think that's not necessarily true. The Massachusetts reform has turned out to be super costly, and I don't think, and I could be well,
we can check this. Or someone could go. All the polls I've seen is that it's got problems, but it's popular. Majority support it. As far as everything I've read about it, and I could be wrong as well, but that was always my impression. And it was certainly my impression that Scott Brown was defending it on the campaign and saying that, and he wasn't saying, oh no, they're going to take this awful thing and expand it. He was saying it was basically the Massachusetts equivalent of keep your government hands off my Medicare.
Yeah.
But then also, it's funny, I got a phone call because I wrote a book about the Christian right a couple of years ago. I'm on all of these lists. And, I'm on, so I get some of their robocalls. And I got a call on Saturday from Jay Sokolow of the American Center, not from him, but, a recording of him, saying, this healthcare bill is an abortionist dream come true. It's going to mandate that every healthcare plan in the country cover abortion. It's going to mandate that every doctor perform abortion and every hospital allow abortions to be performed. My point is that there's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. So if you think that your voters are really unhappy because they believe that healthcare reform is going to, cut their Medicare benefits, mandate abortion coverage, and establish death panels, then I don't really think that you are in that much long-term danger of voting for this thing, given that by the time people go to the polls, there's going to be some evidence that none of these things have come to pass.
Well, I think if you look at the broad reasons why the reform process or the reform bill is unpopular, one is what you said is right. The process has been ugly. It's involved a lot of kind of campaign, do as we do, not as how we campaign, like the promises to make it all completely open. And the strategic, Obama move to have to try to buy out industry support and have them be part of the crafting of the bill, that leads to a lot of sort of suspicion and mistrust. So yes, process is...
Oh, it's funny that that's what leads to suspicion and mistrust from the right. Because I at least don't get the sense, and maybe you have a different perspective, that the right plans to crack down on the insurance industry...
Well, it's
in any way, that like the idea of kind of right wingers, people voting for Tea Party candidates or people voting for Scott Brown because they're angry about giveaways to the insurance industry or to the bankers. Is there any sense in which Republican governance that you can see would have less giveaways to the insurance industry and the bankers?
To the bankers, probably, yeah. Surely the bailout began under Bush. And as did the prescription drug benefit, which is the largest entitlement in a generation. So Republicans in power, always suck. You're not going to ever get an argument from me about that. No, but I think voters, you have to make a distinction between sort of the professionalized right and the opportunistic, we're going to pretend that we're against, big governments as long as we're not in control of it, right, and actual sentiments among American people. I think there's a difference. I think it is coherent to be angry at Obama about bailing out banks, as it is coherent to be angry at Bush and anyone else who voted for it, because Obama bails out banks. He might say at any moment that we need to crack down on Wall Street and help out Main Street and all these kind of stuff, and he's trying to reposition
I understand that that's coherent, but what's not
coherent
to me is transferring that anger into vote for Republicans. I mean, besides
it's more of a vote against Democrats, I think.
Right. Well, I guess that, but to me, yes, there's a very kind of crude, eternal throw the bums out sentiment. I'm trying to think of what would be the liberal equivalent. I mean, it's as if you were. If I was angry about the fact that that Obama is, that health insurance reform is, restricting abortion coverage, and so I vote for Republicans to vent that anger. I mean, it's just completely irrational.
I don't know if it's irrational. I mean, if you have policies that are broadly unpopular enacted by both parties, which we do have right now across a variety of things, especially on economic policies, you will vote the bums out. We voted the bums out in 2006 in the congressional elections. We voted the bums out in 2008 in Congress and in the White House. And now we're voting the bums out in 2010. I mean, there's something to it when consistently the parties out of power or the parties in power say, throw money at Detroit, throw money at Wall Street, do these kinds of things that are hysterically unpopular. You're going to see an anti-incumbent fever until someone gets that particular message. That makes sense. I'd like to go back to something that you said earlier, because there's, I think, an interesting parallel. You talked about Democrats, wanting to hold on to this for a generation, or the health care reform was sort of the great last or cause in many ways. There's an interesting parallel, I think, that it suggests. Republicans have the same thing, too, with privatizing Social Security. You remember when that used to be a cause. They, too, like the Democrats, had pretty good, although not 60 Senate seat kind of majority, but a pretty good majority working in Congress, in the White House, after 2004. So you worked on this problem for a generation. You thought about it. You believe in it. Right or wrong, this is what you think should happen. And what happened, it's sort of infamous among particularly libertarian circles, but also just general sort of limited government circles, when Bush, after the 2004 election, said, okay, we're going to do two things. We're going to reform Social Security and then do immigration reform. On both cases, but particularly Social Security reform, which has been more popular and worked on forever, he then punted. The intellectual groundwork that went into it was a mess. He went to the think tanks. The think tanks squabbled amongst themselves, fought for power. It reminds me a little bit of what the Democrats did with health care. You've been working on it for a generation, so how come it took another 12 months? And it was an ugly 12 months and one that wasn't very inspiring for people. And,
but I guess to me the difference...
And it was based on selling a lot of goods to the public that they didn't believe, and I think rightly so. Stuff like this.
Well, I think that one of the differences, though, is that the public was never on board with Social Security privatization, ever. I mean, Social Security is just a very, very popular program,
right.
Whereas there's a widespread sense in the country that the current healthcare system is intolerable and unsustainable, and that things just can't continue this way.
Right. I mean, that has a lot to do with it. But I'm thinking more in terms of just like as a political party, when you're preparing for, making legislation, it is striking to me that they didn't have, something like a 1 to 3 page blueprint. This is how we're going to get stuff done. These are the principles. Everything else is details. It's not going to take 12 months. It's going to take 12 weeks, 12 days, something like that. That's what's surprising to me. Then again, I think
that's surprising to me. I mean, just given the way power is dispersed and all of the different players and interest groups and people that you have to buy off, and just the general kind of ungovernability of the United States. I mean, it's not surprising to me that pushing through major structural changes is incredibly difficult and laborious. And that's what I think people in this. I think that there's a certain amount of denial out in the country about how about the extent of our systematic problems and the extent of, the extent to which Congress is broken and the Senate is broken, and that it's not just that the one guy who was elected president isn't keeping his promises and can't snap his fingers and make everything better for you in 12 months. I mean, there's, I think, a kind of completely irrational, there's some really irrational expectations out there, perhaps fostered by the kind of messianism of the Obama campaign.
For sure.
But there's also, at a certain point, I'm like, when are people going to realize that nobody can, kind of come in there and like Mr. Smith goes to Washington and sweep it all away without some deeper, more structural changes. I mean, maybe that's wishful thinking in terms of the kind of political savvy of the American people, especially in kind of desperate times.
There's a great book that came out a couple of years ago by Gene Healy over at Cato, and we ran an adaptation from it on our cover in 2008 called The Cult of the Presidency that really spoke to this, and it laid the blame in large part at the American voters. I mean, we look to our president to solve every single mundane problem in our lives. And in fact, there was a moment, I think last week, maybe even the day after the Scott Brown debacle, Obama had a town hall, and he loves that format as much as anybody, and likes to gather the narratives and voices of individual people. And people were asking about the just smallest bits of minutiae in their life. What can you do to help through my job application? I forget what it was, but it was something really, really tiny. And he, instead of saying that's not my job.
Right.
At some point it's really not his job, and the expectations, you're totally right. Presidents are obliged to campaign as if they write and pass legislation themselves, and as if they have control over every bit of our life. And while they do try to expand their control over our life, it's very difficult to pass legislation in general, and they don't write it themselves. And I think one thing that Obama is feeling right now, all the way up until the point he became president, ironically enough, he was famous throughout his life, and he would just really strike people as uniquely talented because he could get people, surprising people around a table that wouldn't otherwise ever even be caught dead seen with one another, let alone agree on something. And he would forge this unlikely coalition to achieve an improbable goal. And
I actually think to a certain extent, I mean, on the one hand, he's come up against the nihilism of the Republican Party, and there's no way, there's no amount of kind of cajoling, there's no policy position on earth that could even bring some of the more fair-minded Republicans on board, someone like Lindsey Graham, just because I think current political realities make that impossible for them. But he did. He came up with a plan that had, as much as you might hate giveaways to the insurance industry, and I do, that had the buy-in of the insurance industries, of the unions, of the, of all the kind of healthcare policy wonks, of the Democratic grassroots, at least
some.
A majority of them, despite the really loud voices of people like Firedog Lake. I mean, he did cobble together this somewhat astonishing grand bargain, which now is going to be undone by one freak election in Massachusetts.
Well, I mean, I think that's a simplification. He made the decision to have this grand compromise, and it was a calculation, and it was also, he made the decision to, I think, devolve some authority for various parts of it to Max Baucus and Nancy Pelosi and whatnot. But ultimately, that did not produce an attractive piece of legislation. So it was a great idea in theory, depending on what your point of view is, but ultimately it produced something that day by day by day got less popular. And I don't think that it got less popular because Americans are crazy or stupid. I think it got less popular because it was...
No, I think it got less popular because Americans don't understand. I mean, to a certain extent, they didn't like the process, and also they don't understand it. I mean... I spoke to people. I come from, my husband's family is, we get in fights at family dinners because the stepfather voted for Cynthia McKinney. They're as left as can be, and I got in arguments with them because his sister-in-law who owns a bar was afraid that she was going to have to buy health insurance for her bartenders, and she can't afford to do that. You're not going to have to do that if you have six part-time employees. My mother-in-law is afraid that her Medicaid benefits are going to, or her Medicare benefits are going to be cut. I think there was a tremendous amount of misinformation and suspicion, and well-founded suspicion about the giveaways to the insurance industries, and I think people wanted some kind of, one kind of consistent thing I see on the left at least is that Obama has really frustrated and disappointed people who wanted some kind of punishment, for the things that have happened over the last 8 years. To a certain extent, I think that's justified in the cases of torture and in the cases of some of the abuses of civil liberties. But I also just think that's kind of not his style. That's not the kind of fundamental gestalt of his campaign and his presidency, and rightly so. But there is this very frustrated need for, if not vengeance, at least, some kind of setting right of accounts, as opposed to just starting from scratch and now treating all these people as if they're good faith players.
Well, I think, and you're seeing that, it'll be really interesting to see how Obama repositions himself. And I think we'll all be watching the State of the Union address this week to see it. I mean, some of what he has done is to strike a more populist tone and go after, the fat cat bankers on Wall Street and to talk about executive pay and these kind of things. And because I have to do it once a year, I agreed with at least one sentence that the world's worst columnist, Thomas L. Friedman, wrote a few days ago, basically saying that presidents look shabby when they dabble in populism. And I think Obama, more than most, simply because he's a very likable and very smart and erudite type of guy. So when he starts speaking in the vernacular about going after the fat cats, it not only rings false because of the contradiction with policies to bail people out, but it just doesn't look good on him. It doesn't inspire the best in the American people. I hope that he doesn't go into a petulant direction. I in my mind.
But there's ways to do some. I mean, right? There's ways to kind of rein in some of these. There's ways to rein in some of the kind of casino-like excesses of the banking sector without sounding like William Bryant. I mean, not that, and actually I think he probably could use a touch of William Bryant, although I understand that I agree with you that it kind of rings false because it's not who he is, and he fundamentally is somebody who kind of trusts experts and trusts technocratic expertise over, kind of the passion of crowds.
Let's say you were writing the State of the Union address, which obviously you should. What would you want him to do, given everything?
Well, let me say this. There's been these articles come from time to time where you start having people. I think Jacob Weisberg wrote it today in Slate. Maureen Dowd writes it every 2 weeks, saying they want him to kind of feel our pain and they want him to stop seeming so kind of cold and detached. And I can't even tell you how much I disagree. Like, certainly I want empathy from him, and I've never felt a lack of empathy from him, but I always feel such a sense of relief amidst the kind of hysteria of these various setbacks that he is somewhat kind of cool and detached, and unruffled, because I am not, and Democrats as a rule are not, and so I don't want, to hear too much of kind of the language of crisis. What I want him to say, in my perfect world, would be, I understand, and I think he already has said this, that, I understand that the election in Massachusetts was about voter frustration. And of course, you're right to be frustrated, and you're right to be angry, and you're right to be, anxious about the state of our economy, which, although has been pulled back from the brink, is still in a kind of is still intolerably weak, and people are still suffering terribly. However, we are not going to let, one election in Massachusetts derail the goal that I ran on, derail the goal that we've been working on for the last year, and that's to pass comprehensive health care reform. And although we know that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and although, we understand why there's a lot of frustration, this plan is going to make your life better. This plan is going to ensure that you can't be kicked off your insurance plan because of a pre-existing condition. This plan is going to, he can tell any number of stories about the kind of Kafkaesque, hideous iniquities of the current system, and then say, and because of this plan, that will no longer happen. And then he can pivot from there. What I think, and I'm not sure if this is politically feasible, but what I wish that he would do is make it clear that you can't, the awful, execrable Harold Ford had a column in the New York Times today.
His political advisor had a column, yes.
What?
His political advisor had a column.
Right, exactly. And I can't imagine it seemed like it would have been like a pretty good column if he was running for the Republican nomination. But he's saying, what Obama has to do is create jobs and close the deficit, which is one of these things that about the kind of American public more generally that's so frustrating. I mean, I think that you said before, that the healthcare plan wasn't popular. Well, I think what would be incredibly popular, and maybe the only kind of plan that would be popular, would be a single-payer plan that also ensured there would be no tax increases, and no tax increases, no reduction in fees to doctors or hospitals, and who knows what else. But there's a kind of fundamental contradiction. You're not going to stimulate the economy and create more jobs while at the same time closing the budget, while at the same time fixing the budget deficit. Those are kind of two opposed things. And
well, it is if you dine at the table of Keynes. I think as long as we're talking about fantasy here in terms of what Obama might say at the State of the Union, because I don't think that he's going to double down on healthcare right now, given realities, which is that Pelosi's given up and he and everybody else is freaked out about Massachusetts. What I would like to see is for him to strike a bit of a change rhetorically and acknowledge that the people who disagree with some of his policies aren't doing it out of necessarily, and by people again I mean voters, not the Republicans that he does battle with on a daily basis, but the people aren't doing it because they're bought off by special interests, aren't doing it because they're crazy, aren't doing it because they're stupid. Sometimes they oppose it because they think it's not a good idea, and to acknowledge that and engage with that in his best way, and he is at his best again when he brings people around on a table and says, I know we all want what's best for the country and we have different ideas about how to get there. If he showed more respect for that, because during the healthcare debate and in general during various points of economic policy, he has very shrewdly and I think unfortunately kind of repulsively, and I use that meaning in the repulse sense, try to portray opposition in a blanket form as, well, those are people who are just bought off by the insurance industry, and it's the special interests, and it's the people who want to say no. There's actually people who hate the healthcare system, who defend, for instance, the French healthcare system, and I'm now talking about myself, who don't think that the Obama healthcare system was the right idea. And to engage honestly with those people.
The number of people who are really opposed to the health, I mean, certainly there are people who are opposed to healthcare, who are opposed to healthcare reform because they want single payer, because they want something that looks more like the French system. But that's a vanishingly small number of people.
Well, not just the single payer, but people who are instinctively afraid about the government increasing its role in healthcare for whatever reason, and who are right now specifically afraid about the incredible growth in government spending and the deficit, which is not an irrational fear whatsoever.
No, it's not irrational to fear the growth of the deficit. It is irrational to fear the growth of the deficit and to simultaneously demand that the government do more to create jobs.
It's not. I mean, if you think that job creation can be best obtained by letting people fail, and not spending money on subsidies for home loans to people who aren't creditworthy, and on bailing out Detroit, then it's not necessarily hysterical. If your only critique is cut taxes, and otherwise keep spending all money on everything else, then we're having an argument about the Laffer curve. But if your argument is, hey, look, we can reduce the deficit by not spending all this money propping up industry, then it becomes a more, I think, coherent argument. But I think the point is that Obama has occasionally drifted into a George W. Bush territory of you're either with us or you're venal or against us when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to aspects of the economy, and that's an insult to American people. And
well, not to the American people. I mean, please don't make the mistake of associating the American people with the Tea Party movement or the Republican Party.
I'm not. I'm talking about the majority of people who, for instance, voted for Scott Brown. Right now there is a strong sentiment that is against the economic policies of the White House, and you have to process that and respect that to some level, and respect it intellectually. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to capitulate to it in your words, but to acknowledge that it isn't venal professionalized politics, and it isn't just crazy talk. It is. It's like Keith Olbermann trying to portray what Massachusetts did as some sort of excretion of racism and sexism. It's like, come on. At some point, that state voted for Obama by 26 percentage points or something. Please acknowledge that there's something else going on here. And that's what I would like to see from the president more of, and less of, let's see how I can try to marginalize and discredit the opposition in order to get
let me ask you this. Speaking of the craziness of the opposition, and whether or not the opposition is the kind of intellectually has some kind of intellectual integrity and kind of policy, whether or not look, obviously he's the president and it's in his interest and the country's interest for him to treat people and their fears, whatever they are, as legitimate, and to treat people with respect. But you and I talking here, I mean, in terms of, is the opposition legitimate, or are they just being kind of driven by various fantasies and resentments and gut hatreds? Let's talk about the coming Tea Party convention in, where is it? In
Tennessee,
in Nashville. I mean, what's amazing to me is that, and maybe you can kind of shed some light on this, because you come from the libertarian world. Initially I thought there was a sense that the Tea Party movement was something that was more associated with, say, Ron Paul, and that had more libertarian overtones, and that, did have something of a adversarial relationship to the Republican Party, and not just because it wanted the Republican Party to be more like Sarah Palin. Whereas now it seems to me that the Tea Party movement is essentially the kind of Sarah Palin brigades, and this conference that's coming up, among the speakers are Joseph Farah from WorldNet Daily, who,
world's greatest mustache, by the way, Joseph.
Well, and who also, he actually wrote a column called "Why I Am Not a Libertarian," explaining because without deference to the law of God, human beings will run wild. Yeah. There's Roy Moore, who has, the Alabama Ten Commandments judge, who, among other things, has called for the death penalty for homosexuals. I mean, we just went through a scandal where various people in the Christian right, it wasn't a scandal, but where various people in the Christian right had to denounce the Uganda bill and had to distance themselves from this Uganda legislation that was in part inspired by kind of American evangelical activity in Uganda. Now we have, apparently, though, Roy Moore calling for the death penalty for homosexuals doesn't put him, beyond the pale in the Tea Party movement, which everybody seems to agree is the most important grassroots movement on the modern right.
Well, we have. It's important when we're talking, especially about this particular convention, that it's being widely criticized among the Tea Party movement. They say that the organizer is an interloper. He's doing it for profit. They're charging $550 per ticket. They're paying Sarah Palin $100,000. Joe Farah is no hero, I don't think, to the Tea Party movement. Although, strangely enough, he's an old acquaintance of mine. He's the guy who came up with the headline Night Stalker to describe Richard Ramirez. So I want the world to appreciate his tabloid headline writing skills.
Really? I actually once met Richard Ramirez.
That's really creepy, and I hope we don't ever talk about that.
Well, I was on death row. I was interviewing somebody else on death row, and actually California's death row visiting room used to be where you actually mingled with everyone. It wasn't like you see in the movies. That's another story.
That's what we're talking about next time. Jesus, that's very interesting. Anyways, this is being assailed as an attempt to co-opt the Tea Party movement as opposed to being an accurate reflection of it.
How much is it being assailed, though, just by, I mean, a couple of purists? Or is there a sense that there's a kind of widespread rejection of, say, Sarah Palin and her $100,000?
Sarah Palin she is the fatal attraction for, I think, the Tea Party movement, the Republican party, and a bunch of people. She drives everyone crazy, either in favor or against, and it's an open question. I mean, the thing that I think the takeaway for the Tea Party movement in terms of what's next, what is their character, is that right now they are actually a decentralized being, if whatever they is. It depends on the locality of it, and anyone who has tried to speak for them too soon usually get punished. I would, in my experience with them, which is limited, just to sort of paying attention and then walking around at the 9/12 rally in Washington, Sarah Palin is popular. A couple of Glenn Beck is popular. A couple of other politicians, not very many. At the time, Joe Wilson, the guy who shouted "You lie," was popular just because that was the previous week's news. I think right now Scott Brown would be popular, even though his policies they would disagree with. But the point is that I think attempts to turn it into a political party at this point would fail because they disagree on many things. They disagree on Sarah Palin. They disagree, I think, on national security, the Ron Paul kind of elements of that, which is not a majoritarian element, I don't think, in the Tea Party movement, nor is the libertarian tendency, I don't think, a majoritarian in that movement. They disagree very, very strongly about national security. I mean, Scott Brown, in his speech, which was his victory speech, which was occasionally charming and occasionally cringe-inducing. I wanted to reach out and throttle him when he talked about, like, what are we going to give rights to terrorists instead of our patriots, this kind of stuff. Is that a big part of the Tea Party movement? I think they have yet to work that out. But I think to try. Then
why is this movement? I mean, I think this movement is something that we have to grapple with as an important. As an important factor in American politics, but nothing that you have just described strikes me as in any way, something that we should respect it because they're human beings who have these resentments and frustrations, but what you just described to me is simply a congeries of resentments, frustrations, and hatreds.
Well, welcome to politics, Michelle. I don't recall a lot of the, I was at the Democratic Convention in 2008, 04, 00, and especially in 08. But also 04, you didn't lack for resentments and hatreds directed at the people in power, and rightly so. I think
that's true. But you could also talk about something that was an affirmative Democratic platform, whereas what you're talking about is a movement that is united only by its resentments and hatreds, but that ultimately disagrees on the kind of most fundamental political questions.
It is the things that they have been stressing. Let's start from there. Are all about reducing the size and influence of government. That is a consistent theme throughout. There hasn't been much stress so far, although I think there will be about immigration, and I think that'll expose divides within the Tea Party tent. There hasn't been a lot of discussion so far about foreign policy. It is a movement that is worried about the growth and size of government. It's worried about bailouts and thinks that those are unfair. I happen to agree with those things that they are stressing. When that crystallizes into something more, when it starts getting into social issues, for sure, I'm going to be in strong disagreement with it. But I think there has been demonstrably those couple of big themes. It is so far an anti-big government movement, and you may hate that, but it's not that it is completely incoherent or sort of default not worthy of respect. I mean, one thing that being permanently marginalized in politics, as libertarians are in general, and as I certainly have always been, it perhaps gives you more respect for voices of people who are characterized as marginal. I am surrounded on a daily basis by policies and people in power that I disagree with remarkably, and yet, am able to keep my cool. And I wish that the people who actually have power and accumulate it and exercise it or sympathize with it would show something similar to people who are slightly more marginal, even if they look weird, act weird, and
But they're not marginal. But these people aren't. I mean, that's what I guess to me is that this to me does not strike me as a movement that's marginal. It strikes me as a movement that has been essentially ruling the country for the last 8 years. Believes it's a kind of right-wing, Southern-inflected Christian nationalist populism, which I think this is in a new guise. That they've been ruling the country for 8 years. They believe they have a fundamental right to rule, and that's a large part of why they see the Obama administration as intolerable. I mean, they just see them as intolerable interlopers. When you constantly hear them say, this is my country, and who are these people to be, this rhetoric of Obama being a foreigner, a Manchurian candidate, of being kind of completely illegitimate. I don't see them as, I guess, there's a certain extent in which there's this kind of, conservative stance that they're not marginal. They've been ruling. They have a network. They have a political party, and they've been ruling and they ruled the country for 8 years.
Yeah, I don't see
them as marginal.
My experience with them so far, I don't see the white Christian nationalism thing at all. I mean, it's just
right. No, I think you're right, and I've heard that. But also, I mean, look at this. But I think that it's merging into a kind of broader, just by the very fact of its leaders being people like Sarah Palin and Glenn Beck. It's merging into a broader kind of age-old right-wing tendency that veers between the extreme isolation and suspicion of the John Birch Society, occasionally during times of Republican ascendancy, gets more evangelical and kind of expansive and messianic, and then again, when Democrats are in power, retreats once again into suspicion, hostility, and paranoia. But I think it's the same thing. I don't see any difference between, or obviously there are differences around the edges, and movements constantly change and evolve and make new alliances. But it strikes me as essentially not that different than what Richard Hofstadter was writing about however many decades ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think the world has moved on from Richard Hofstadter's both social science and social creativity. A lot of what he wrote was back in an era when you couldn't legally marry a black person if you were white, and vice versa. I think there's been the Richard Hofstadter Rehabilitation Program of 2009 and 10.
Who I consider myself very much a member.
Has been fascinating to observe, but I think when you are reaching back for explanations of modern phenomena to some things that were written in 1963, then that is almost a sign that you're not grappling with what people are actually saying, and that you're looking for ways to sort of
saying. I mean, there's so much of the rhetoric of this movement that comes straight out of the John Birch Society manuals.
Nothing about communism,
there's nothing about communism. They think Obama's a socialist. Look at Glenn Beck. He's producing 2-hour documentaries on his program that's basically about how Obama is the second coming of Mao and Stalin, or the third coming of Mao and Stalin. There's nothing about communism. It's all about communism.
No, I mean nothing about like an active communist conspiracy. Yeah, there's tons of...
Of course it is. They're always they're always talking about there being like a whole bunch of these kind of subversive radicals in various roles in the Obama administration. That's the whole kind of essence of their critique.
Again, all I can base it on is when I walk around and talk to people. I don't...
And you don't see hammers and sickles and talk about socialism.
I want to punch people in the face when I see them because I lived in hammer sickle land, and I don't enjoy that kind of historical or ahistorical hyperbole, and I don't enjoy it when it comes from the left either. That you would see it, anti-war Bush protests as well. But I don't think that there is the same kind of critique that you saw from the John Birch Society of, okay, there is a communist conspiracy right now. What can we do about it? And this is how it
Wait, but I just have to ask you, you have said that Glenn Beck and Sarah Palin are, kind of the two of the most respected and recognizable figures in this movement. Surely you've watched
popular among. I don't think that they are leaders, but
Glenn
Beck.
Among. Surely you watched Glenn Beck, and I don't see how you can watch Glenn Beck and not say that he is basically saying that there is a kind of socialist totalitarian conspiracy that's about to kind of undermine the country and turn it into one big kind of slave concentration camp under the auspices of the United Nations. I mean, his rhetoric is a combination of John Birch society, with the overlay of kind of, Mormon apocalypticism.
I've written that if the Tea Party movement becomes, the Glenn Beck movement, then it will deserve richly its coming failure. But I don't think that's what's animating it ultimately. And I think that, it would become less popular on a daily basis and not more popular on a daily basis if it was, wallowing in the same kind of performance artist, free associative nonsense that you see on his show. But we're running up against your interview time, so I don't want to.
Okay.
You need to.
Well, actually, you know what? I'm glad to be leaving that on a somewhat. I mean, because obviously, if you're right about this movement, then it is, much less cause for anxiety than the movement that I see out there, which strikes me as kind of channeling something, very dark and atavistic, whereas what you're describing is at least, a kind of set of political views that I don't agree with, but that can be reasoned with and accommodated.
I would just point out that, on so many levels, American society, even in these horrible times, are improving. I mean, just think in terms of 10 years ago, we actually cared that, Ellen DeGeneres was coming out on TV. Oh, my God, what does that mean? And, the world that we live in terms of just acceptance of gay people right now is so different. And I think on racial attitudes, on a lot of things that we, legitimately and worried about 50 years ago on groupings of people, it's different. It's changed. If the Tea Parties are all about a whites-only basketball league, they will fail so spectacularly and so quickly we will not ever hear from them again because America's not a racist country.
I think they'll fail, but I don't know that it'll be spectacular or quick. I think that the last gasps of dying ways of life can actually be kind of quite powerful and dangerous.
That's an interesting way of putting it. Let's stop there.
Okay.
Very good talking to you.
On that happy note.
On a dark, horrible note.
For a dark, horrible month.
It's some of us had a little bit of a better time this past month and week. If what's happening is restraining the ability of the federal government to make sweeping changes, then libertarians tend to be a little bit happier than they were the week before. And with that, I'll let you sulk into your coffee and prepare for your interview. It's very nice talking to you, and let's do it again soon.
Yeah, you too.
Okay,
Thanks
bye-bye.
a lot. Bye-bye.